welcome back to another video, folks, another guide to add to the painting of Flames of War. This is a guide that a number of people have asked me to do, and it's not the painting of the figures, it's the basing of the figures. So I'm going to show you how simple and straightforward it is if you've got the right material and the right approach, and how you can make something interesting like that. Attractive basing really helps gun teams such as this Nebelwerfer stand out on the tabletop and really catch the eye, and that goes for infantry too, where basing is a really important finishing touch. So let's start with the basics, folks, before we move on to some clips where you can see me putting them into use. For me, the thought process that goes into basing is a combination of three factors, and making sure those factors all work together and not against each other. Those factors are the base material and its colour, the ground cover, and the miniature itself. Got a couple of examples here. So here we've got a very dark base colour with a lighter uniform colour and then an even lighter ground cover colour, and there are three different varieties of lighter colour in that ground cover. And then over here we have dark ground cover, light saturated kind of ground cover, and then a lighter, kind of in the middle kind of colour, lighter than the ground, darker than the grass for the uniforms. So these all work together so that close or far away you can distinctly see the shape of the base, and it's got a bit of interest because it's not just one colour, and you can see the figure standing on it. People in the past used to ask me what makes, or how do I make a nice looking Flames of War figure. They would be quite focused on the painting but not confident about painting such small figures. And I used to tell them, when your army's on the table, everybody is seeing, for infantry and guns, they're seeing the bases. So if you can concentrate on producing a nice looking base, you're halfway there. You don't have to worry so much about how the figure looks if the base is attractive. Your basing can be as simple or as complex as you want, as can the materials. Here we're creating a bit of a story with how we're putting the completed bases together. It takes a bit of planning, but the process itself is simple, whereas objective markers could have something more complex going on, such as you can see in this bocage objective, where the tank is bursting through the hedge, and it's got a lot of elements been added. You can also have simple objective markers where some nicely contrasting elements have been brought together, as you see here without the tank, to make a very attractive scene. And then you can bring all together, if you want, objectives and infantry into one big story if you wish. Let's have a look at the ground now, you know, the foundations for what you're going to be doing. So there's two different kinds of bases you'll be working with. There'll be the newer bases with the recesses for the figures to go directly into, then the older bases where the figure would be glued on top. And I take different approaches based on what type of base I have. Starting with the old base, these are some I literally did earlier. These are Nebelwerfer crew, and they're for the Hermann Göring units. So I stuck these guys on, and be mindful when you're putting figures on in this approach, guys, that you have enough space between them where required to get your whatever tool it might be that you're using in between the figures with the paste, you know. So I've stuck them on, and then I have built up the base using good old-fashioned wall filler. That's all it is, nothing special, and that'll take a day to dry. And this is going to be the finished surface, so I've made sure it's rough and irregular so that it'll take a coat of paint and a dry brush. Though be careful when you're painting these guys, if you leave the paint on too thin, this is a crystalline substance that will react to water, and that water may cause it to shine a little. So just be careful and have a look at your finished result, and if necessary, put a bit more paint over it. Now, if you're going with this type of base, you can keep it really simple, to be honest, or you can cover the whole lot. What I do is I put a dollop of this earth texture on at the bottom of the figures, and then one at a time squeeze it in. You'll know how much to use with some practice, and any excess I flatten it out around the figure. Then we do my next one, and my next one, and my next one, and then I fill in any area that has no excess on it up to the edges of the base. And then when it dries, these will be secure. They won't come off. You'd have to tear it out to make it come off, because it's a strong, flexible bond. And then you're going to have an even surface all the way over, which you can leave looking like this, or you could do, for instance, here where I've painted it sand colour. You know, you can paint this stuff, you can wash it, you can dry brush it, you can put pigments, wet pigments over it, so many different things. But that will then get you your base coverage, and then you just have to think about edges. These new ones, I just leave the edge unpainted. That way it's very durable, it's not going to get chipped, and it looks nice. I've had people ask me when I've showed complete pictures of these bases, what paint did you use for the edges? So it must look good, and it saves you a bit of time, otherwise you've got to paint all the way around. And here's two different approaches. I've got one where the edges aren't really noticeable. You sit it on the table and it just sinks into the background, or edges that frame the base. And it really just depends what you prefer, to be honest, but that's the idea. Framing or just blending into the background. Here's a look at using the Vallejo Paste when you have a base which has figure inserts. These inserts are quite big, they're not as tight as the new plastic bases, so I'm putting the material into the cavity, so to speak, but normally I would just put some on the bottom of the figure and then push it down into the space, as you'll see me doing in just a minute here. There you go, in goes the figures, a little bit of excess material squeezes up, and then you've got a really strong fit. Once that's dry, it's going to grip that in tight, and then you can just work the excess down across the tab around the base so that it blends in nice and smooth. There's a nice transition. If you are going to be putting a nice solid covering of grass around the feet, you don't necessarily have to be so thorough at this point, but if you are, it gives you more options about how you're going to approach the application of any grass or ground cover later in the project. I've got an objective marker project on the go here. It's mid-war project for my SS forces at Kursk. The main focus is this half-track. That was a spare half-track I had from the Flames of War box set. You can make lots and lots of different versions of the half-track from the box set, and this was originally a spare mortar half-track, and I thought, no, let's do something else. And I scratched together a radio antenna to make it into a communications half-track. I used some scrap to put together what I'm calling a radio. You can see it's sitting there, it's sitting on top of where the ammo box was. It's just a crate with a little bit of plastic card down the middle. I could be painting lots of dials and everything on there to try and make it look more like a radio, but I'm not going to bother. I've got a motorcycle sidecar rider to be the radio operator. Someone to go inside standing about. Whoops, got a map table which I will add maps to, maybe even a couple of mugs, and then a couple of officer figures standing about, plus another motorcycle sidecar combination which will be standing about waiting on orders. And all that's got to fit onto this base. It can be done because I have sort of dry fitted it. But let's focus on the basin now. So this is something you might want to do with any base, but certainly with one of these old smooth bases that you used to get is scratch the surface so you get a good grip with your glue and your surfacing material. Now, just like with some gun teams, like large bases, you're going to have a lot of area which is just going to be, in this case, the plaster filler just stuck to it, and that can lift. So I'm going to use some old tabs that I kept off plastic bases, and I'm going to glue them to the surface where the likes of these guys are not glued in, so that there's going to be lots of hard areas for this to attach itself to, and much less likely that it will just lift off. So let me start by putting these guys on and where the table will be, and once I'm happy with the positions of everything, I shall get some of these little tabs in place. So there's a dry fit. Quite happy with how they will look in general, and quick calculation, 4 of them underneath where the half track is, and actually probably another one underneath where the motorbike is, because the half track and motorbike will sit on top of the completed surface. This will keep the completed surface nice and strong. I'm gluing some scraps onto the big open surfaces on the base so that the plaster will have a good grip and won't just pop off. Normally when the base is covered in figures you wouldn't have to do that, but in this case it helps if you do. And then I'm just applying it as evenly as possible over the surface, because I'm going to cover this with the Vallejo paste when it's dry. I've left this to dry for a day. Smooth down the edges a bit, get rid of any little misty looking areas where some of this white can be seen like a mist on the edge, because when you're painting the edge you want a nice solid piece of plastic to paint on. And then maybe just as well sharpen up the edge a bit, just draw your nail carefully along it. And there you go, it's good to go. Now, if there was any particularly lumpy bits, I would deal with them here, especially around the tabs. You don't want a big lump of white to be here, which is going to make it difficult to get the paste over it. But that's it basically ready to go. I'm going to cover the whole thing with this, and then start positioning all the various components. So let's start with getting some of this paste on. The paste is quite a sticky substance, folks. Use a good tool like I'm using here though, and it'll go on really quite easy. It'll cooperate if you cooperate with it, so to speak. Don't put on too much at the one time. Don't get any stuck onto the completed miniatures. You will be able to wash it off, but that could be a whole world of pain. So just take your time, get it down thin, even as possible, because remember this is to be a finished surface. The paste will dry with a nice grainy texture, and you just don't want to make it too deep as well, folks. Keep it nice and thin just to cover the plastic or the plaster underneath. We've got the whole thing covered and we've got a surface now, so you've got to be happy with this look. You're going to be covering a lot of it with grass or other ground cover, but if there's any bits sticking right up, you maybe want to deal with them. Because I'll try and maybe show you here. See, it raises a ridge and you don't necessarily want that. So if you clean your device, your tool, whatever it is you're using, You can just draw the brush across, draw the tool across and smooth it down. So just think about doing that wherever required, but try and keep any marks you're leaving as random as possible, unless you're wanting to create a specific feature, you know, a geographic feature on it. But that's now ready for the components to be added, but we don't mess about here, folks. This stuff is going to start drying pretty quick, so we need to move on to the next stage. Let's take a look at a Nebelwerfer project I'm doing just now. I'm just scraping the bases clean of any excess filler that's on there, and then I'm applying the paint, being careful not to add too much water. It's got to be enough so that it flows freely over the surface, but not so much that it starts to bring out the crystalline structure of the material. And then I'm taking a smaller brush to work closer into the figures. Once again, you don't have to be too careful here if you are going to be covering all around the base of the figures in grass, but if it's covered up, you know it's going to be fine for the next steps, and you don't have to try and do any fixes at a later point. And then a bit of a dry brush. Don't worry if you've knocked any little bits of the surface off as I did there. You just cover that up with a bit of grass if it's not in somewhere vital that needs to be left uncovered. And there's going to be a nice surface ready for the ground cover. I'm painting the edges with some flat earth. It's going to take at least 2 coats for this to go on, folks, so just be careful, take your time and use the edge of the base itself as a guide. If you're careful, you can't really go far wrong with this. And the guns I am going to attach, the Nebelwerfers I'm going to attach with some of that Vallejo paste. Once that dries, it'll be a nice strong contact, because you're filling in any cavities, any unevenness between the spades or the supports of the Nebelwerfer. See, I'm adding extra paste where required, and when it dries it will stay and won't budge anywhere or pop off during transport. "24 hours later and the surface has dried." So at this point you could be applying a wash of pigments, you could be painting the surface, washing it dry, brushing it. I'm not though, because there are so many ins and outs, nooks and crannies in between legs and wheels and all kind of things on this that it's just a bit too daunting. So I'm just going to go straight to the flocking stage. As I mentioned before, these grey bases benefit from a coat of paint. It's a great way to frame the base. I'm going to be using light mud, as you'll see. I'm not going to film that because I'm just painting nice straight lines. And remember, by the way, folks, any mistakes you make with any painting elements here, you can cover up the worst of your sins with just some grass, some flock or such likes. So I'm going to paint the trim, the edge of the base, then we'll get some grass and some tufts onto it. There are so many potential settings your bases could be for. Here you can see a winter scene. This is an autumn scene where a few autumnal colours have been added to the base just to set that scene in the mind of the viewer. Then you've got the desert, when there's so many ways of making sandy bases as well as the bog standard, so to speak. Nice bright green finish. So the finishing products, the ground cover, so to speak, there's just so much out there. There are so many choices. I tend to stick with formula that works for me, and I don't try to reinvent it too much. But the key is balance. The key is getting the right balance between what is showing in the way of the groundwork, what is going to be seen in the way of the ground cover, and the figures. Things should be complementary, but they should also be contrasting. You can see here there's enough of the dark brown base colour showing to really show off the grass, which is green, but the tufts are even more obviously green, if you see what I mean. So they're standing out, and at the same time none of these colours clashes with the uniform. So you have the right balance of base material, ground cover and figure cover, so that everything works together. And you can see that again here. Got a nice dark base colour, lighter uniforms, and then even lighter ground cover. So all the elements work together and don't work against each other. So I use unthinned PVA glue, any kind of wet glue. I don't thin it down. You know, like thick PVA is going to hold whatever elements you put on a base, like tufts or whatever. Thick PVA glue is going to hold that. You'd have to tear it off. If you thin it down, there's a chance it will just fall off, you know, because it needs to be thick and gelatinous in order to fill in the unevenness of the base and perhaps of the tuft itself, and especially clumps. So I use PVA glue. I don't thin it down. I don't use super glue because of the risk of misting, especially because you're going to be using a lot of it. I'm going to go with this for ground cover. I've got a nice bright green, very green grass, and a nice dark brown tuft. So that will give me two elements that will contrast with each other, but will also contrast with the base. As you can see, the light mud edge is soft. It's not overly bright, but it's a nice frame for the base. And then, as you can imagine, with some of this green going on here as well, it's going to really help give it a three-dimensional focus for the eye. So, white glue, old brush, here we go. Let's get some glue onto this now. So I'm using unthinned PVA glue here. That's going to give you the strongest bond. And I'm just figuring out what contact points on the base and the miniatures I might want to cover up, and what shape I want the grass to be, and therefore what shape I want any bare patches to be. I find it best to work in a tray. This is probably too small a tray. Something bigger would probably be better, just to catch all the little bits of flock and tufts that are going to end up scattered all over the place. And then I just stick it on like this, as you see it, folks, making sure it's a very solid contact so there's no glue shining through. You can use static grass applicators, but that's a whole different subject, and it'll give you quite a different look. Very, very attractive, but one that will take a bit more time perhaps than this approach. But there's plenty of videos out there on that subject, folks, if you want to check out static grass applicators. The grass is on, and you can see it's a bit patchy, so we're seeing some of the surface underneath, which gives a nice bit of variety and helps just draw the eye so it isn't just one block of colour. So let's put some tufts down. Now, tufts along the side of tracks always look good, so let's just... Tufts can be used not just for a variation of colour, but to help frame all the components that you've got on the base, like, you know, by the side of the half track, under the opening at the front or the rear of the half track, beside the motorbike. It adds a bit of depth and helps settle the elements into the base, and you can put them on corners, significant points, just to help frame the finished look as well. In general though, tufts will add a bit of depth and a bit of height to the base, which gives an overall more three-dimensional appearance. I hope you found that interesting, folks, and it gave you a few ideas to put into practice for yourself. If there's anything specific I have not covered, please stick a question down in the comments below and I'll get back to you. Oh, and I decided not to put the puns into the video, folks. If you're still watching this, it's your own fault. I didn't use flocking nightmare or tuft choices to make. If you've got any of your own puns though, folks, stick them in the comments below and let's all have a good cringe.